Here is something that changed everything for me as a leader, and it will change everything for you as well. I call it the distinction between being a buyer and being a seller, not in business transactions, but in how you show up every single day for your life. Now, before we dive in, I want you to think about a recent situation where you felt powerless or desperate to make something happen. Maybe it was trying to close an important deal that your quarterly or yearly numbers depended on as an entrepreneur. Perhaps it was attempting to retain a key employee who was considering another offer. Or maybe it was trying to get buy in for a project that you deeply believed in from some skeptical shareholders. How did you feel in that moment? Were you anxious, desperate? Did you find yourself willing to compromise more than you initially wanted to? Were you focused more on what you might lose than what you truly wanted? And I have been there. We have all been there as entrepreneurs. That desperate energy kills deals, destroys confidence, and honestly, it is exhausting. I remember being in exactly this position early in my journey as a coach supporting some of the most inspirational changemakers on the planet. I remember I was pitching a potential client that would have been 30% of my annual revenue. As that meeting progressed, I could feel myself becoming increasingly anxious, more willing to make concessions, more willing to doubt myself even when there was no reason to, more focused on not losing the client rather than whether it was actually even the right fit. I was being the seller, and it showed in everything from my body language to the compromises I was willing to make. Today, I'm going to show you how to walk into any situation, whether it is a board meeting, a client negotiation, or a team discussion, from a position of power, clarity, and choice. Shifting from being a seller to being a buyer can completely transform your leadership effectiveness, your business results, and even your mental health. So let's dive in. What exactly do I mean by this distinction of being a buyer versus being a seller? Being a buyer means you exist in a state where you know exactly what you want. There is a clarity about your standards, your values, and what you're looking for. You're not confused, you're not desperate. In fact, you are clear and you're centered. And second, and this is a crucial distinction, you're completely willing to walk away. If you're a buyer, you're completely willing to walk away if what you want isn't available. It's like going to a store to buy something. If you don't get what you want, you will walk into a different store. Now, this is not a negotiation tactic. It is a genuine state of being, of detachment from the outcome that you want, because you trust there are other opportunities. While still being fully committed to your vision or the end milestone, you have what some people call with or without you energy. You are willing to walk away. Third, you naturally operate from a position of choice and power, not power over others, but the power of your own agency and enoughness. You're choosing rather than being chosen. That's a big distinction. And fourth, you embody a clear standard that defines who you are, not just what you want. Your minimum standards define the ground rules on who you are and how you operate. And being the seller, it is actually the opposite of all of this, right? When you are being a seller and you have a customer in your store, you want to sell them something. You are reeking with that energy. But if you're being a buyer, you will go to 10 stores and then buy something when you really get what you want based on your standards. But when you become a seller, you think that customer that walked in, that's the only customer, or I have to make a sale to that customer. That's two very different states of being, two very different conversations, two very different energies, emotional states that you bring to any conversation. Let me give you an example. When I was working in the corporate world, I used to enjoy my deep one-on-one intimate conversations with my teammates more than anything else. And I used to think how beautiful it would be if there would be a career just based on that. So this is what I did. I built a career not based on what other people say coaching is or team development is or leadership development is. I built a career on my own terms. I became the best at what I wanted to do, which was saying no to anything which falls below my standard, which was deep, intimate one-on-one conversations. And I built a career on having those one-on-one conversations. Being a seller means you are unclear about what you truly want or you truly need, and which leads to accepting almost anything, which leads to compromises. Being a seller means you feel unable or unwilling to walk away from the table, regardless of what is on offer. You operate from a position of perceived need or desperation. You compromise, you bend. And perhaps the most damaging, being a seller means you have no minimum standard. You will continuously lower your price, your other quality, other standards just to make something happen. Now, let me make this concrete with an example which we can all relate to. Now, think about the difference between these two job seekers. The first one is desperate for any job. They have been unemployed for months and they are starting to panic. In interviews, this person is trying to figure out what the interviewer wants to hear and then shape themselves accordingly. They will accept any offer, any terms, any conditions just to get employed. This person is being a seller and they are selling themselves short. Now, let's take another example. Another job seeker. This person is clear about their skills, their value, and what kind of role would truly leverage their talents. Now, they have done their research on the company that they are interviewing and they are evaluating the organization as much as the organization is evaluating them. If the role or the company culture doesn't align with what they are looking for, they are prepared to continue their search elsewhere and walk away. This person is being a buyer in that interview process. They are buying a career opportunity. They are buying their future. They are not selling themselves or their skills or their talents for a particular role. Now, out of these two people, which person do you think comes across as more confident, more trustworthy, and more talented in the interview? Which person is more likely to end up in a role that truly fits them? And which person do you think has more negotiating power when an offer actually comes? Now, here is what is fascinating. This distinction applies everywhere. It applies in actual business negotiations for sure. It also applies in how you deal with your board. It also applies when you're looking for a new opportunity, a new job. It also applies when how are you interacting with your team. It applies how you approach partnerships, and it also applies in your personal relationships. I recently coached a CEO who was struggling with his board. Every board meeting felt like an interrogation, where he was desperately trying to justify his decisions and performance. He was showing up as a seller, trying to convince the board to buy his leadership. We worked on shifting his state of being to that of a buyer, someone who was evaluating whether the current board dynamics were supporting the company's mission and his leadership, not the other way around. It took a few weeks for this shift to totally sink in his body, but the shift was remarkable. In the very next board meeting, rather than desperately defending his decisions, he calmly explained his reasoning and then asked the board members, given our strategy, does this approach make sense to you? And if not, what specific alternative would you suggest? He was no longer selling his leadership, he was buying their partnership. And the entire dynamic of the relationship changed. He did not have to justify as much as he was doing it earlier and was able to challenge or even just stay silent with the board in their questions. The board meetings transformed from interrogations to collaborative strategy sessions. Now, that is the power of shifting your state of being before you change anything that you do, any actions, any tactics. If you can shift your state of being, and especially for this video, it's about can you become a buyer in whichever meeting, whichever conversation that you are in. Now, as a leader, this distinction becomes even more crucial. And anybody who is a business owner, who is an entrepreneur, who has a big responsibility, I would call them a leader. Now, the first reason this distinction is very important, or even more important for leaders, is that your state of being is contagious. When you embody being a buyer, you create a culture where excellence and clear standards become the norm. When you exist as a seller, you create a culture of compromised standards. Even your team gets infected by your state of being. I have witnessed this transformation at a software company where the founder had been accepting any client who was willing to pay, regardless of whether they were a good fit for the product or whether the company would actually deliver what the client needed. And this created a culture of constant firefighting, customizations that diluted the product roadmap and led the team to burn out. Like there was a time when the team told me that we never say no to a client. That's being a seller, that's not being a buyer. There was a lot of activity in that company, but very little growth or satisfaction, even despite the productivity or the work being done. After a month of working together, the founder made it clear to their clients and to their employees as well, the company would be selective about which clients they worked with. They articulated clear criteria that clients would need to align with the product's core capabilities, show willingness to implement properly, and demonstrate respect for the team's expertise. The founder was now willing to walk away from deals that did not meet these criteria. The transformation, both with the clients and within the team, was remarkable. The sales team started to pre qualify prospects more carefully. Implementation became smoother. The team morale improved because now they were showing up as leaders and they weren't constantly dealing with misaligned clients. And very interestingly, the company's close rate actually increased because they were focusing their energy on the right opportunities. Now, that is what happened when you shift from being a seller to being a buyer. As a leader, you face constant pressure to compromise. The market wants faster results, stakeholders want bigger returns, employees want more resources, and customers want lower prices. Now, if you don't have a clear sense of knowing who you are, being a buyer, your standards, knowing what you truly stand for, and what are you willing to walk away from, you will get pulled in every direction. You will have no weight, you will have no center. If you are an entrepreneur, if you are a leader, I'm sure you know this feeling. You are in a meeting and somebody makes a request or a suggestion that doesn't align with your vision or values, but saying no might create conflict. You might lose the deal or it might create disappointment. So, in that moment, what do? You compromise. You say yes when you actually meant to say no just to keep the peace. You lower your standards even when you know it will not help you in the long run. So, do you do that? Or do you maintain your standard even if it means walking the tightrope for the short term? Now, I remember working with a family owned company's third generation CEO who was facing pressure from his executive team to cut quality, to improve margins, and accelerate growth. The company had built its brand on premium quality and customer service, but competitors was now undercutting their prices. So his team made a very compelling case. Small reductions in quality that probably nobody would notice, but that could significantly boost profitability. In that moment, this founder, this family business owner had a choice: be the seller and accept the compromise, or be the buyer and maintain their standard. He chose the latter, saying that the moment we start compromising on quality is the moment we lose what makes us special. I would rather, he told me and he told his team, I would rather find other ways to improve margins or accept lower margins than change who we are as a company, as a legacy. This company had a 50-year legacy before this third generation business owner actually became the owner. Now, that decision was not easy in the short term. But 3 years later, when most of their competitors are now engaged in a race to the bottom on quality and price, his company has remained distinctive and actually grew their market share among quality conscious consumers. Now, that is the power of being a buyer as a leader. Third, if you are in any kind of leadership role or a role with big responsibility, every decision you make, the stakes are amplified. When you make decisions from a seller state, those compromises also cascade throughout your organization and get magnified many times over. Consider what happens when a leader accepts a client or a project that doesn't align with a company's core strengths or values. That one compromise doesn't just affect that decision, it impacts every person who has to work on that project, potentially for months and years down the line. It diverts critical resources from better aligned opportunities. It can even shift the company's direction over time and dilute the culture as resources are invested in similar misaligned projects. Now, what is fascinating is that when leaders shift their state of being to become a buyer, they don't have to push or force their organization to change. It happens naturally because they are showing up differently. This brings me to a critical point. Being a buyer doesn't mean being rigid or inflexible. It is not about being difficult or unreasonable. The best negotiations happen when you have two buyers at the table, two parties who know what they want, have clear standards, treat each other with equal dignity, equal worth, and are willing to walk away if those standards are not met. That is when you get genuine win win outcomes rather than compromises that leave everyone feeling shortchanged. Would you rather negotiate with someone desperate to close a deal who will accept any terms, or someone who knows exactly what value they bring and what they are looking for in return? The latter actually makes for better, more balanced deals. As leaders, we must recognize that our state of being sets a standard for our entire organization. When we embody being a buyer, we create a culture of excellence, clarity, and a powerful choice. Let me share my example. When I started as a coach, I started talking to a lot of CEOs, but none of them became clients. because I was putting them on a pedestal. I did not set any clear terms. I was so desperate to get them as a client that none of them actually became a client. I am sure they could smell that desperation. They could smell that I was willing to compromise and I was being a seller. I wanted to sell myself. After a couple of years of doing this and getting this into my bones, when I became a buyer, I set clear terms. I said, this is how I worked. And I walked away from many deals. It saved my time, it saved my energy, it made me feel good even when I walked away, because I found myself aligned and committed clients. Rather than just more clients, I found myself more committed clients, which is exactly what I wanted. Now, there is another dimension to this distinction that is rarely discussed but very important at the same time. And that dimension is the profound impact this distinction has on your mental and emotional well being as a leader. Being a seller is exhausting. When you exist in this state, you constantly feel the need to please everyone, which is impossible, anyways. You feel responsible for outcomes that are not within your control. You live with a nagging sense that you have compromised something important. And perhaps most damaging, you erode your self confidence over a period of time. Because you see yourself as having lower worth than the person in front of you, you think you need them more than they need you. So you erode your self confidence, self respect over a period of time. And there is no way that doesn't show up in your conversation. There is no way that doesn't communicate. Even if you use the same words, there is no way your lack of confidence or lack of self-worth doesn't communicate to the other person. Now, I have a client who built his company based on a powerful mission to impact a million's life. Last year, he was looking for some funding. And initially, as a seller, he started talking to investors. And he started to please investors because the investors has money and he wanted money. So he put himself on a lower pedestal. But later on, after our coaching, he saw that he was not asking for money. He was sharing an opportunity of impacting a million lives with investors. And he became a buyer. He showed up as a buyer, which basically meant he went out to investors and he said, I am going to raise this amount of money. It's up to you to invest or not invest. Anyways, I am raising a small amount and there are a huge bunch of investors out there. So if you want to invest, we can show up as equals. But if you don't want to invest, then that's perfectly fine. It is your opportunity to lose and I will reach out to somebody else. So he just continued in this phase. In fact, he started challenging investors to say yes and no to him rather than give them maybe or come back to later. What happened as a result? Not just he raised the amount he wanted to raise, he got some wonderful feedback on the product that they were building and he iterated on that. But even among the investors, people started to talk about him. Like, who is this guy who is so confident? He almost created a pull energy towards him rather than a pushing energy when you're trying to be a seller. See, the hidden cost of being a seller over a long period of time is not sustainable. It leads to burnout, disillusionment, and eventually resignation. You give up, either literally leaving your position or psychologically checking out. In contrast, being a buyer creates a fundamentally very different emotional experience. Like, irrespective of whether you get what you want or not get what you want, being a buyer creates a fundamentally different emotional experience. You feel centered. You experience genuine confidence that comes from knowing your worth. You enjoy the freedom of setting clear boundaries. And perhaps more importantly, you build self-respect, self-esteem, self-confidence with every decision you make, even if that decision is to walk away. Now, I have coached many leaders who initially feared that being a buyer might make them seem difficult or cost them opportunities. In fact, the reality proved exactly the opposite. They found that they were more respected, had more influence, and attracted better opportunities. People wanted to talk to them, people wanted to be in their presence, precisely because they showed up as buyers. One CEO described it this way: when I stopped trying to please everyone and got really clear about our company's standards and what we would and would not accept, I actually started enjoying leadership again. I actually started enjoying my role again. I stopped dreading difficult conversations because they stopped being difficult. Because I wasn't trying to maneuver people into accepting something. I was simply being clear about what would and would not work for us. And it's like this huge weight was lifted. He told me that he would simply show up and do his thing every day, whether it was in front of a client or potential client or an employee. He would simply show up as who he was, owning the worth of who this person was, their values, but also owning the worth of the product, the service that they were building for their clients. Now, this emotional and mental shift isn't just about feeling better, Though that's certainly valuable, it directly impacts your effectiveness as a leader because you show up with more clarity. You're not trying to please somebody. So you're more clear, you're more confident, and you show up with conviction rather than desperation, doubt, and willing to compromise. So, how do you make this shift? How do you transform from being a seller to being a buyer? This is not about tactics or techniques, right? This is an inside out transformation. Here are the core elements of this shift. Step one is to become really honest, really clear about where are you being a seller in your life. Where do you feel powerless? Where do you feel frustrated? Where are you unwilling to walk away? Where do you feel desperation creeping in? These are the places where you are being a seller. One of my clients realized that he was being a seller with his largest client. 40% of his revenue was coming from that one client. With this one client, he would become a seller. He would accept unreasonable demands. He would rush timelines. He would even accept disrespectful treatment, disrespectful language towards him or his team members just because he was terrified of losing this largest client. And just recognizing this pattern was powerful for this person. So the same for you, right? Identify. First step is identify where you are actually being a seller in your life. Now, step two is clarify your standards as an expression of identity. This is not about just what you want, it is about who you are. What values are non negotiable for you? What standards make you who you are as a person, as a leader? Now, that same CEO was dealing with late payments with that client, with no surprise, and never holding the client accountable. And we worked on this simple standard that we deliver excellent work and we get paid on time. That is who we are. In the next call with this client, which was 40% of his revenue, he calmly explained that services that he is providing to this client of him would go offline unless payment was made in the next 30 days. So he gave the client a final 30-day deadline and made it very clear. And to their surprise, it required no negotiation, no pushing, no convincing. They paid. And the confidence on his face after that was incredible. Right? He told me, I never thought it could be so easy. I never thought I could lay out my terms, my standards like that to somebody. Now, you can't do the second step until you can practice the third step, which is walking away. At least in low stakes situations, you can start to practice. You can start to build this muscle gradually. Now, another client of mine told me about the first time that they walked away from a potential client. It was scary, but they felt so good after that. This potential client wanted customizations that would derail my client's product roadmap. In the past, he would have found a way to make it work. He would have compromised. But this time, he calmly explained why it couldn't be accommodated and suggested that their solution was not the right fit. So they walked away. But he came back the next day saying that I've never felt so good. Like, even I said no to an opportunity, I walked away, and he came back to me saying that I feel really good about myself because he felt this surge of integrity and clarity, and that energized him for weeks and allowed him to show up in a powerful way with other potential clients and actually create more clients with ease rather than trying to get one client over the line. And now number 4 is create space for depth rather than breadth. Right? When you're a buyer, you understand that exponential results come from quality, not quantity. So structure your schedule to reflect this. One CEO I worked with implemented a very simple no meeting day, no calls on Wednesday. So just deep work on the most important projects. He even dedicated 4 hours on this Wednesday without any computer, without any media, without any phone, only for thinking, only for reflection. His team was skeptical at first, but the results spoke for themselves. Now, what happened was strategic thinking improved dramatically. Even initiatives which were stalled, the team started to make breakthroughs. Either they let them go totally, or they said, we have to follow our decision. And it was very clear from that no meeting Wednesdays. And he started by leading by example by doing it himself. Initially with some skepticism, but slowly other leaders in the organization also started to follow. Now, fear can make you believe that being a buyer means losing deals or opportunities. But the reality is quite different. As I have shared in a few examples earlier, when you genuinely embody being a buyer, you actually attract better opportunities, stronger partnerships, and more respect from yourself as well as from others. People value what is scarce, and leaders who have clear standards and the willingness to walk away are unfortunately all too rare. Good leadership is scarce. People are hungry to be led by good leaders. There are not enough people being a buyer. So if you can become a buyer, you will actually have more opportunities rather than less. And remember, this is not about saying no to everything. This is about being so clear on your yes that everything that doesn't align becomes an automatic no. When you exist only as a seller, you're playing a very small game. You're focused on getting the deal. You're desperate to close the deal. You're willing to compromise just to stay at the table. And that state leads to incremental results at best, and more importantly, exhaustion, burnout, and all of that. But when you exist as a buyer, you are playing an entirely different game. You're playing a long term game, pursuing only what aligns with your highest standards and greatest goals. You're not compromising. You're not going for smaller and safer goals. You're going for what you want, not what you think you can get. This state of being naturally leads to exponential results. As the author Dan Sullivan says, being busy is 2x. Being a buyer, that's how you achieve 10x results. Now, let me share another story. I worked with two founders in the same industry, complete opposites. Mike was a seller. He accepted any client, pivoted based on whatever the market wanted, hired whoever was available. Now, 5 years later, he had a business which was 5 million in annual revenue, and that required his constant attention. On the other hand, let's take another founder, Sarah, who was a buyer. She was crystal clear about the problem that she solved through her product. She only took clients who had that exact problem. She was patient in building her team, choosing the right employees and not just whoever was available. Now, the same 5 years later, her company is now 50 million. It is continuing to operate without her constant involvement because the team is better, the quality is better, the product is better. Now, that is the difference between 2x and 10x results. Now think about leaders who have truly transformed their industries or created remarkable organizations. Steve Jobs, he was famously a buyer. He was ruthlessly clear about Apple's standards, and he was willing to kill products that did not meet those standards, even though those products might be generating revenue. Another example is Sarah Blakely, who built Spanx into a billion-dollar company by maintaining her standards for product quality and refusing to compromise even when retailers pushed back. Now, Reed Hastings transformed Netflix from a DVD rental company to a streaming giant by being willing to walk away from their original business model. These leaders did not achieve exponential results by constantly compromising and accepting whatever was available. They did it by having absolute clarity about their future, their vision, their standards, and the willingness to walk away from anything that did not align with that. Even when that created friction, even that created disappointment, even when people did not understand those decisions. Now, the truth is, your state of being as a leader creates ripple effect far beyond what you can see or measure directly. When you shift from being a seller to becoming a buyer, you don't just transform your results, you transform the very culture and DNA of your organization. That is why this distinction is so powerful. And perhaps even more importantly than the results, it impacts the happiness, the joy, the aliveness that you feel, the confidence that you feel, and then your team feels. As a result, you transform yourself. You discover a new level of clarity, confidence, and conviction that changes how you show up, not just in business, but every area of your life. You will become a better parent, a better friend, a better spouse, not just a better leader at work. So here is my question to you. In your biggest challenge that you're facing today, who are you being? Are you being the buyer or the seller? Are you clear about what you want? Are you clear about your standards? Are you clear about the minimum standards below which you are willing to walk away? Or are you compromising your standards because of fear? Fear of losing an opportunity, fear of a short-term deal or a transaction. Start small. You don't have to change your life entirely today. Pick one relationship, pick one situation where you have been a seller. Pick one conversation. Go back to that conversation, but get clear about your standards first. Consider what it would mean to becoming a buyer in that conversation, in that relationship, and notice how differently you show up, even if you have to make some uncomfortable decisions. Remember, this is not about making life follow what you want. This is leadership. Leadership is not always easy. But also remember that this is not just about what you do. This is also about others. And this is about who you are being before you do anything. It's your state of being, which you carry into every conversation, makes all the difference. The most successful leaders I work with have mastered this. They know what they stand for, and they are willing to communicate that clearly, and they are willing to upheld those standards and lift other people up to their standards as well. They have clear standards, right? And they walk away from anything that doesn't align with them. You can make this shift too. It starts with a simple recognition. It requires some clarity, but it also demands courage, right? As I said, it sounds simple, but not easy. But once you do it, everything changes. It's like a ripple effect. Momentum slowly builds and everything changes in your life, your inner state, as well as how you speak, how you act externally. So if you found this valuable, like, subscribe, or leave a comment below so that the algorithms, the LinkedIn, the YouTube algorithms can do their work and it reaches more people also. As you transform your leadership, that's a small act you can do to help this video reach more people so that you can become a challenge for their growth, their shift to being a buyer in their lives. If you got something specific out of it, if you're going to apply what you heard from me today in a specific area, or if you have already applied and produced results, then leave your comment with the biggest takeaway or a big breakthrough that you ended up producing after this video. So until the next time, keep choosing leadership, keep deploying yourself. Thank you.